but welcome to everybody who's already here. And we're quite curious where everybody is from for today's lecture. So if you feel comfortable, put your location in the chat. I'm based in San Francisco. I'll get started. Hi, Keith. Aha, I thought there might be some Oregonian on our on our call today. We have some international folks as well.
Great.
I'll give it one more minute. Hi, Mimi.
Mimi helped host a talk and tour in Monterey for us this summer. Thank you for doing that.
Okay, well, why don't I get started? I don't think anybody's really here to listen to me anyway, so I don't think people who log in a few minutes late will be too disappointed if they miss my introduction. But my name is Eleanor. I am the co-vice president of CGLHS, at least through the end of this year, the California Garden and Landscape History Society. I am based in San Francisco, California, and I work as a historian in the field of historic preservation with a focus on landscape history and gardens. So that's how I got involved with our organization. Most of our work here is about landscapes and gardens here in the state of California. So today's lecture is a bit of a departure from us, and I'm looking forward to the discussion afterwards, because I do understand that several people who are very familiar with this firm, more familiar than I am, have logged in and are familiar with this book and know Val personally. And I think we'll have an opportunity to get really deep into some details after the presentation if people are interested in that. I just learned, however, that Val, our speaker today, the author of the book, does have a personal connection to our organization. One of our founders, David Streetfield, was her mentor and taught her a lot and introduced even Lord and Schryver to her. So that's a nice little connection that I had no idea about. And I'm really sort of brings this all home for me. And I'm feeling very happy that we've decided to co-present on this topic today, even though we'll be talking about gardens in the Pacific Northwest and not necessarily in California. So before I get too far into that, I do want to give a little nod to the fact that CGLHS is hosting a conference here in California, in Los Angeles next month. The topic is the past, present, and future of the Los Angeles River. It's the return of our annual conference, which has been on hold for a couple of years, but we're bringing it back now, and we have managed to schedule most of our events for open air activities, which is good. There won't be a lot of indoor activities, and we'll be encouraging masking. So I would encourage everybody to go look at our website and review the itinerary. It will take place in LA in October 14th through 16th. And we'll be riding a little open air bus up and down the Los Angeles River and getting out and doing some tours and having some people talk with us for that weekend. So I think it will be really great, and I encourage you to join us. The conference is how I became involved with CGLHS, and it's one of my favorite things that we as an organization do and present to the public. So that being said, let me get to the topic for today. We'll be talking about the Northwest Gardens of Lord and Schryver, based on a book that was published about 1 year ago by author and historian Val Libby. And I think with that, I'm just going to go ahead and hand it over to Val. I'll be returning right at the end after about 40 minutes to help facilitate our discussion. So thank you so much for being with us here today, Val, and I look forward to hearing your lecture.
Thank you very much. It's a cool, rainy, overcast day in Maine, and I have to work out how to advance my slides because they're not advancing. So,
Hmm.
hmm,
Try your arrows. Do the arrows help?
well, they're not doing anything, which is, okay, got it.
There we
We're
go.
good. We're good. There's always a little technical glitch at a certain age. Um, anyway, the book, The Northwest Gardens of Lord and Schryver, was really a collaborative effort between many volunteers over many years for the Lord and Schryver Conservancy in Salem, Oregon, under the direction of the past president, Bobby Dulp, who made it her project to make sure that their history was documented and published in an accessible form that everyone could use in the future. A lot of the groundwork was done well before I joined this group project. And Judith Tankard, who is a well-known landscape historian in Boston and an expert on Beatrix Farrand, was the individual who pointed me in the direction of working for them when they were seeking an author. And it's a little bit ironic that you have an author who lives 3,000 miles away from the place where they need to be working, but it all went superbly well. It took a long time, but I think any good book takes a long time. It took us 4 years. But as I say, I really like to credit the other volunteers who worked on this to turn out a beautiful project, including the editors at the OSU Press. So the two ladies you see on the left-hand side are the shorter lady is Edith Schryver, who came from the Hudson region of New York State. And the taller lady is Elizabeth Lord, who grew up in Salem, Oregon. Locally and to their friends, they were always known as the girls. And I like to think of them as the girls, particularly when they started out. But you'll see by the end of my talk, when they were in their 80s and they were still active with civic organizations who came to them for their expertise, I like to think of them as the grannies, because that's certainly the role they would have filled in my life at that point. They started their firm in Salem, Oregon on January 1st of 1929, and they closed the office 40 years later, but they continued to work up until almost the time of their deaths. And Elizabeth Lord passed away first in 1976, and Edith Schryver died in 1984. Because they were still volunteering and still being called on to serve on commissions in Salem and being called on by organizations and institutions to help with landscape design. I'm going to go to the next slide here. Elizabeth Lord, you can see the dates on the left-hand side, was a very elegant, beautiful young woman who came from a prestigious family. William Lord, her father, had served in the Civil War as a major at the age of 24 for the Union Army. And after the war, her father obtained a law degree, and then he went back in the military and oversaw the transfer of Alaska territory from Russia to the United States. Following that, he decided to settle in Salem, Oregon, which was the capital of Oregon and not long established, and open a practice there. But his practice quickly led to a political career. He was governor of Oregon in 1895, and after serving one term, he was appointed minister to the Argentine in 1899 and remained there till about 1903. Her mother, who you will see shortly, was a very beautiful woman. The interesting thing about these two ladies is that one is from the West, and I guess I should say West Coast, and one is from the East. And combining their talents, coming from different family backgrounds, was a little bit of a challenge for them. But Edith Schryver was a very adventurous young woman and was willing to go west. She really wanted to see the rest of the country, and so she did. And you can see that both of them really loved their pet dogs. So Edith is on the right-hand side. So in terms of Elizabeth Lord's background, her father was very prestigious, but her mother was highly educated woman, originally born in Boston, but raised in an upper-class family in Baltimore. She was quite beautiful. She was tall, she was stately, and she is known to have entertained President Lincoln at a Union League ball in Baltimore in 1864. She probably met her husband from his work in the Union Army, coming to Baltimore during the war period. And they wrote back and forth to each other for many years before they actually married in, oh, and I can't quite remember the date that they married, but one or the other finally said, don't you think it's time? And William Lord persuaded her to move to Salem, Oregon with him, where they lived in a very modest house in a newly developing neighborhood of the city, the capital city, but it was surrounded by rural area. And Juliet soon became a leader in the social world of Salem, Oregon, and her daughter also stepped into that role with her mother following the father's death in 1911. Now, Edith Schryver's history is a little bit different. Edith Schryver came from a more modest middle-class family in Kingston, New York, which is right on the west side of the Hudson River. Her father, George, ran a restaurant in a railroad station originally, and Edith worked as a waitress there. The family lived in an apartment over the railroad station. Later on, he ran the Kingston's first taxi service, and then he became involved at an early stage in selling automobiles. So he was quite an entrepreneur as well. And you can see them camping on the right-hand side. That's quite a rig for, early 1900s. And some of these photographs we had to use because various volunteers with this project absolutely loved images like this. And David Lichter, who's a retired doctor in Salem, loves this photograph of the Schryver family camping. So this is dedicated to him. So as Edith was growing up, she was a very lively young woman. She was very engaged in committee work. She was an editor for her high school yearbook. She had a boyfriend at that time, and she loved animals. She loved color. She loved art. She loved decorative things. And so when she graduated from high school, she decided to go to the Art Institute in Brooklyn, New York to study. But she only remained there for a year. And I'm not really sure why she left, but her mother became very ill during this time. And her mother actually passed away when she was only 19 years old. Edith decided to continue her education at the Lothrop School of Landscape Architecture and Horticulture for Women in Groton, Massachusetts. Why she decided to pursue this course, we don't really know. It seems that her father neither discouraged or encouraged her, but during the time when she first went off to college in Groton was when her mother passed away, and then her father remarried. I have underlined Edith's portrait with her freshman class at Lothrop, and Lothrop became quite an important school for young women at that time because there were only 3 colleges in the United States that allowed women to study landscape architecture. One of those was Cornell University, one was the University of Illinois, and the third was the University of California at Berkeley. And so if you didn't intend to pursue a university education, you could go to Lothrop. Several years later, 2 professors at Harvard opened their own sort of semi-attached school for young women to study architecture and landscape architecture. But Lothrop was modeled on similar colleges, private colleges that had developed in England in the 1890s. And the founder of Lothrop, Mrs. Edward Lowe, had attended one of those colleges, Swanley Horticultural College, during her youth. When she inherited her husband's wealth and was living in Boston, she decided that these were very good careers for young women to enter so that they could be independent, so that they could earn a living, and so that they didn't have to feel like they were a burden on their families if they didn't marry, and they didn't have to marry if they didn't want to. So Lothrop was a 16-acre property in Groton, and you may recall the Groton School for Boys was located there. I guess it still is in operation, I'm not sure. But it was located on a railroad line from Boston so that they could attract faculty to come out from Boston to teach the young women. The 16 acres were developed as beautiful experimental gardens that the students maintained, and students were in residence for the most part. And this was a typical arrangement for the women's school like this. They also had greenhouses. They produced vegetables and sold products locally. They had field trips, and they had practical work to do both in the lab and outside in the gardens themselves. So on the right-hand side, you see a photograph of the colonial era house at Lothrop and the show border that the students maintained. Among the fellow students that were there with Edith at this time, and the program was usually 3 years, I'm afraid I marked out her face with the red arrow pointing, but there was a friend of hers from that time until the end of their lives, Diamond, who became a very significant landscape architect in New York in the 1920s, 30s, and on for that time. So this was her class. In the background are some of the faculty, and at the far side of the image, holding on to the shaggy dog, is the lady who acted as both housekeeper and sort of house mistress for the residential component. Now, Lothrop had very fine teachers associated with it. And one of the, I'm going to jump ahead just for a minute here. One of the people who was very supportive of Lothrop was Ellen Shipman. She is credited with being one of our first landscape architects, though she never had a professional education. She was self-taught, and she was also instructed by Charles Platt, an architect and landscape architect living in Cornish, New Hampshire. Ellen Shipman has been the subject of many fine books by Judith Tankard, so if you'd like to read about her, I highly recommend that. The faculty who came to Lothrop to teach included some of the first women landscape architects in the Boston area. Ellen Shipman did not teach there, but one of her first assistants in the office did, and that was Elizabeth Leonard Strang, who did have a degree in landscape architecture, who developed this graphic plan style for Ellen Shipman and then taught the students at Lothrop to use it. And what is different about this plan, particularly from an architect's plan, is the extensive notes that were handwritten right on the plan, but also what I call vignettes, which are three-dimensional axial views into different spaces of the landscape that they were proposing. Let me go back 1 minute here. Students from Lothrop typically had field trips to Cornish, New Hampshire, and that would certainly have been a long day trip in the early 1900s. Edith Schryver went there twice. The students would visit various historic gardens and the homes of prominent architects and artists, such as Augustus St. Gaudens's house, which is now a National Historic Park. Also, they would see landscapes designed by Charles Platt, and you can see his house on the left-hand side. As soon as Edith graduated from Lowthorpe, and they did not receive a degree, they received a certificate, she went to work for Ellen Shipman. Well, first of all, she was a summer intern for Ellen Shipman in Cornish, but then she was Ellen Shipman's one of her assistants in Cornish, New Hampshire. So that community was very important, I feel, in shaping who Edith Schryver became, because it was a community of artists and writers and designers, many of whom were women, and women were strong and they encouraged each other to build the community. It wasn't just built around the male artists. And I think that's a very important aspect for any young woman entering a professional field, to have that kind of mentorship and model, because I doubt that Edith had it from her own mother. And Ellen Shipman was also that type of role model for her, having taken on the role of landscape designer when her husband left her with 3 children to raise in Cornish, New Hampshire. And that's another story that is very interesting to follow in women's history. But many of the aspects of what went on in Ellen Shipman's office were aspects that Edith Schryver learned to adopt. Also, Ellen Shipman did not do a lot of the designs herself. She went and visited the client, collected the information, took photographs, took notes, sent them back to her office, and had her assistants come up with the plan, design it, draw it up, do all the specs for it, as we say, specifications, and then she would present it back to the client. This meant good management was necessary. And during the 1920s, Ellen Shipman bought, and actually I may be wrong on the date, it may be 1910, she bought a building in New York so that it would be more convenient for her to meet her clients. And there were 2 apartments in the top of her building, as well as an entire studio. And Edith Schryver lived in that building while she was working for Shipman. Now, Elizabeth Lord's path to landscape architecture was a little bit different. The 2 met on a tour of European landscapes and monuments in 1927 that was offered between the Lowthorpe School and the Frost School of Harvard. Both were programs for women. Edith Schryver wanted to take a sabbatical from her work. She had been with Ellen Shipman for about 5 years, and Elizabeth Lord had just started her studies at Lowthorpe. Conveniently enough, and as the story goes, while they were sailing across to start their tour, and they would leave Montreal and land in Glasgow, Edith Schryver was seated at the children's table for dinner in the dining room because she was so petite. And when she asked for a glass of wine and it didn't arrive, she changed tables. And I'm sure there was a bit of a shuffle over that. And supposedly she was seated next to Elizabeth Lord at the adult table. Well, the 2 found, as in the course of their travels, that they really had a lot of common interests. They shared a perspective on gardens and a love of gardens and also plants. That became a very strong bond between them. And by the time the tour was halfway over, Edith was already planning to go on to see some of the Spanish landscapes that the group would not be traveling to see, and also to go to Mallorca to see the landscapes there, and persuaded Elizabeth to join her for an extra month or so of travel together. Now, already their roles were developing. Edith was the designer and the artist. And so I use this example from her travel journal, which all of them were encouraged to keep, of how very fine workmanship she did. She was the graphic artist. She was the primary designer. She was the person who had really adopted the type of landscape design skills that were taught at Lothrop. Elizabeth was a plantswoman. Her mother before her had been an incredible plantswoman and gardener. And she would always use that as her strength, and also in terms of business management, leaving more of the design work for Edith to carry out. And they both did photography during this trip, and they would trade off doing black and white photography. So this is 1927 is where they met. Elizabeth Lord returned to the United States to go to Lothrop. Edith continued working, they corresponded, and by 1928, only a year later, they decided, okay, Elizabeth's going to graduate early, and they're going to Salem, Oregon, where Elizabeth still had the family house, and they're going to open up their own practice. And from that point on, they were intrepid travelers. It amazes me today with how difficult it is to fly anywhere on any time schedule, how people in the early 1900s traveled the world by steamship, by railroad, by the early automobiles, and by airplane. And of course, yes, it was mostly the upper classes who traveled this way. But if you consider how difficult it is today, it's really pretty amusing. And fortunately, we have all these wonderful photographs from their travels. Elizabeth Lord's brother, her older brother, ended up being the manager for a sugar plantation, first in Hawaii and then going to the Philippines to run the business from the Philippines, where he remained through World War II when he was imprisoned, and he was released later, very, very ill person, and died. So they did have periodic trips to the Philippines and traveled through the rest of Asia and also traveled through South America with her older brother. So what do we know about the Willamette River Valley? And I specifically wanted to talk about the geography of that area for people in the East and people in Britain who have heard this book talk. It is not immediately on the coast. It's actually inland at least an hour, and you have the coastal range in between. It's a long, very, very fertile river valley extending up to the Washington state border. Portland is the major city in the north of the valley, and then you carry down the valley to Salem and to Eugene, where the University of Oregon is located. Originally, the Native Americans used this area for hunting and for agriculture. It does flood a great deal with spring rains and at other times of years too. So the soil is very fertile. It's surrounded on both sides by mountains, and it attracted Methodist missionaries from the Midwest in the early 1800s to come there and begin to colonize and to move the Native Americans out and take over those agricultural areas. Salem did not become a state until what was it, 1858. Maine became a state in 1820, and the timber resources, first of all, it was agriculture and milling and timber products that allowed the state to grow its economy. And the mills were built along the rivers and streams so that they were run by hydropower, which we're going back to again today. But it's a very interesting area, both for the native flora that exists and for the ecology of the area. There were not many landscape architects in Oregon or Washington state in the 1920s when the two ladies moved out there. And Elizabeth Lord had inherited the benefit of a trust fund when her father passed away. Then her mother passed away before she went to Lothrop. The family house was still hers in Salem, so they had a place to move into. And obviously she could afford to buy a car and could live fairly well. We sort of speculated at the Conservancy what the life of these women would have been without that trust fund. And I think it would have been very difficult for them to really earn the kind of living that they enjoyed the benefit of without it, even though they worked very hard. Because during the Depression, everybody basically was out of business. So here's what Salem looked like in 1915, and the city was laid out on a grid by the Methodist founders. A long series of blocks was set aside in the center of the city to be the Capitol Mall. And at one end of this block, there's a large area for a park as well. The courthouse was to be at one end of the mall and the Capitol building was to be at the other. And the reason this is important is because the city was laid out as a grid. It was not densely developed during the time of Lord and Schryver. It is now pretty densely developed. A lot of the historic buildings have survived. And both Lord and Schryver worked on maintaining a park system in the city and also improvements for that Capitol Mall and protecting it from overly ambitious government officials who wanted to fill it up. As we see with most of our public parks, let's put something in it. And they said, no. So Salem was their base. And one of the first large properties that they designed was from a person migrating from Southern California, Daniel Jarman, came to Salem to run a department store. And he brought with him his architect and his contractors. He had just had a house built in Southern California on a Spanish colonial style. And even though this is not really the most appropriate architecture for Oregon, this is what he wanted to do. And it certainly stood out in the neighborhood that he built it in, which was Gaiety Hill. So it sits on a hilltop. It's a beautiful white stucco structure, rather complex, and had a comfortable sized property with it. It looks down on the city even today, and the garden areas have largely been preserved the way they were designed by Lord and Schryver in 1929, which is pretty amazing and shows how much people have enjoyed these gardens and how much respect they had for the original designers. Now, if I could put a pointer on this, I'd love to show you how the Edith Schryver integrated the landscape spaces within the architectural layout of the building, but I'll see if this works. Also, these plans were always hand colored. Typically, they were watercolors, and they have been preserved at the University of Oregon archives. The slide on the right-hand side was a photograph that was also hand colored. To the left, another hand-colored slide from 1930, and on the right, a photograph I took of one of the patios of the Jarman house and garden in 2018. And you can see how little things have changed there and how well maintained they are. So from the ladies' study of Spanish, Moorish, and Spanish historic and Moorish landscapes that they saw and they measured and that they loved, they designed this garden. They were reading articles in the Salem newspaper. They saw that Daniel Jarman was coming to Salem, and they wrote to him proposing that they design the garden. So they were very proactive in their advertising. They also made sure that a local gallery hosted an exhibit of their work as soon as they were settled in Salem. And their work were the landscape plans they had done at Lothorpe. Now, just to show that Lord and Schryver were not just capable of designing private gardens, but they really had the abilities to go beyond that and design large-scale developments. This is a naturalistic design with a naturalistic layout for a hot spring resort that was going to be built in the mountains and required permission from the forestry department to carry out this plan, even though the land was privately owned. Brighton Bush Hot Springs is a natural hot springs that was revered by Native Americans. A couple bought the area to develop a resort there, and the design that Edith Schryver created is based on a curvilinear layout. The only large open area is for a community gathering place outside of an inn. She also laid out the area where cabins would be located. And at that time, camping with your automobile had just become popular. So they designed what was called an auto camp. I don't know actually how much of this was carried out. I did not go and visit the site, but it still is a resort. A lot of these areas changed during the 1970s as the rest of America changed with the hippie generation. So who knows what it is today, but it is still there, and I understand still operating. For other private landscapes in the area, this is a beautiful garden that has been preserved not far from where Lord and Schryver actually lived in Salem. It's the Charles Robertson Garden, and it was laid out on a long, narrow lot on a hilltop. The end of this street looks way down to a view of the Willamette River below, and it drops off pretty steeply. But because from the road you approach this property at a low elevation, and then you're going uphill through the house and out the back of the garden, and it's not terribly large. They laid it out always so that there was a very comfortable approach. There was a formal entranceway. There were the practical areas for parking. Often there were areas for laundry yards and an outdoor arbor where you could sit during hotter weather. Each of the areas of the landscape relates in scale to the building, so that you have a connection between the garden areas and the building that you do not always see today so carefully coordinated. And this was the style of design that they were taught at Lowthorpe. Axial views from the primary windows or doors of the house leading out to the garden. Again, very pragmatic areas to be used and enjoyed for outdoor living. And this is well before the 1950s and 60s outdoor living Sunset Magazine movement. So again, this is 1931. And I put an arrow in there to show you the terrace that runs along the back of the house, which is a narrow flagstone terrace, beautifully planted, and the way it looks today. It's still very similar. Now, often Lord and Schryver were able to work with an architect that they knew well and that they had a very good collaborative relationship with. And in this case, the same architect that designed the Robertson house also designed a new house for them in Salem. They sold Elizabeth Lord's parents' home and divided the property, which was large enough to actually retain this segment of Elizabeth Lord's mother's flower garden, but with a completely new house designed for them to use. And then Edith was able to design a new landscape, but she had to incorporate areas that had been part of a much earlier garden, such as this flower garden. So again, she did this by using axial views through primary windows, through French doors leading off the terrace, going out to a pergola that you see in the background. Being very pragmatic, they had a service area, they had a laundry yard. The houses in Salem typically used a back alley for all their services. So the cars were not parked in front of the house, they were parked behind the house. your waste bins went out the back of the house, and this still is really nice today and keeps the street relatively open. But they moved the house on the lot fairly close to the avenue so that they could have more space in the rear of the house that had privacy for their gardens. And then creating a series of gardens which would be at a height of bloom at different time periods, different seasons. And this is something that goes back to Gertrude Jekyll's garden lessons from England back to 1880s. And then her books that came out in America in the early 1900s. They had a reserve garden where eventually they built a greenhouse. You screened the area either with shrubs and small trees or with fences for privacy. And it is a beautiful landscape. So these are just several views of different areas of the garden at different times of year. The green gate is the rear entrance to the garden, which they named Gaiety Hollow, and it's a bit of a spiff on their neighborhood being called Gaiety Hill. And part of the rumor for this was the partying that went on there. And maybe Karen can give us a little bit more of the history of Gaiety Hill. It doesn't sound like Methodist missionaries to me, but what do I know? And it's an interesting house design because it's extremely comfortable inside, but it strikes me as a little bit odd on the exterior. Some refer to it as a combination of English cottage and I've forgotten what the other term for it was, but the interior spaces are just beautiful. And you have a progression of areas to move through in the garden. Very good for socializing. So Lord and Schryver's relationships with their clients and contractors were very interesting. Elizabeth Lord was very outspoken, and I have a great affinity for her at this age. If I think it, I tend to blurt it out and get in a lot of trouble. I don't think anybody would get on Elizabeth Lord's case because she knew what she was talking about. And she had come through those social circles that had given her a prominence in the Salem and the Northwestern society that when she spoke, others listened. Edith, as you see here from the back, rolled up her sleeves, got out there, told the contractors what they should be doing. And you also see the client in this case, Mrs. Avison, paying attention to this. But the women who went through the Lowthorpe School were taught specifically how to deal with male workers. And they did, because no male office was hiring women landscape architects in 1920. And that's why the women often set up their own practice like Ellen Shipman did. During the Depression, Lord and Schryver had to deal with a lot of workers doing WPA projects in Salem with no training, no building or horticultural skills. And the women would often get pretty annoyed at them when the guys didn't want to go out to work because it was raining. And they said, when did a little rain stop women from working? So I think you'll enjoy reading the comments that I included as much as possible from these two ladies, because they're just priceless. And I mean, all of us are putting our fists up saying, right on. Go for it. Go for it, Elizabeth and Edith. And this again was a favorite photograph of David Lichter. So we had to use it. I mean, how could you not? And doesn't it express it all about they were going to do it their way? Occasionally, Edith had an argument with an architect over the size, dimensions, or layout of garden areas, and she usually won. And she would explain exactly what she was thinking and why the area worked her way and why it wouldn't work any other way. And that was great. So this was one of the later projects they worked on, the Avison Garden, which is outside of Portland, I believe. Now, their neighbors, who were also very good friends, included Alice Brown Powell at Deepwood and the Bush family across the street from them at what has become Bush's Pasture Park and the Bush House Museum. Both of these large Victorian mansions, Victorian era mansions, became public parks for Salem over following decades. And Elizabeth Lord and Edith Schryver were involved in designing the layout for the gardens and the landscape when they were practicing. And usually it started in the 1920s or 30s. But they were also involved when the city took over these properties later in the 1960s. Elizabeth Lord was appointed to the Parks Commission, and then she headed up the Street Tree Commission for Salem. When they were rebuilding the Capitol building in Salem, she was appointed to the Capitol Mall Commission, which she didn't really want to join, but she was persuaded to by the mayor because of her knowledge of landscape architecture. And then usually Edith Schryver would be drawn in to do the design work. They did a significant amount of work at Deepwood, most of which has been beautifully preserved and restored today, and is actually worked on. This garden area on the right is maintained by a group of volunteers that work on at both Deepwood and the Gaiety Hollow property. My favorite design was one that Edith did for Alice Brown Powell. She called it the Scroll Garden. It's also known as the Boxwood Garden. And it's this wonderful Baroque plan around a lawn area at a lower point on the property at the base of a hill, a small hill. And at the time that it was designed, there were only a few trees around it. Unfortunately, now the area is very shaded out by the growth of trees. But it was inspired by, and I have to show you this, it was inspired by a wrought iron railing that came off a building that was demolished in Portland. And it seems to often have been the case in 1920s and then later 1940s, but mostly 1920s, where these beautiful wrought iron railings or banisters were recycled into garden ornaments. And you see them appearing, I don't know if this was true in California, but you see them appearing in various Northwestern gardens as buildings were being taken down. So the wrought iron railing was the inspiration for this Baroque plan. And you can see how open the area is with the woodland on the right-hand side of it. And then in the colonial revival garden style, you have these little boxwood and boxwood cones leading your eye to the back of this rectangle. And the feature in the rear was to be an oriental tea jar from China that Edith and Elizabeth picked out in the Philippines that they bought for Alice, their friend, and that Montague Lord had shipped back from the Philippines. And it has now gone over, for safety's sake, to Gaiety Hollow because public parks are not necessarily terribly secure. This area, however, has grown up with too many trees around it. And so if I was head of preservation for Salem, I would be taking them back and away from that and restoring the landscape. The planting within those boxwood edges was in a color scheme to complement a rusty orange color that the railing was painted. So it was orange and yellow and brick red azaleas. And I think that would have been super. So you're seeing it at a very early stage, and then you're seeing Alice with her friends gathered around the tea jar later in around 1940. An aspect of landscape architecture that many books about landscape history do not deal with is the importance of nurseries. And for Lord and Schryver, this was critical. Elizabeth Lord was an expert in the Northwestern flora and in what ornamental plants grew well in the Northwest. Edith was coming from the East, and she had her own favorite plants. But for many decades, when they were designing many of these gardens with an outline of boxwood, they had to import that boxwood by train from Eastern nurseries. And gradually they found and they persuaded Northwestern nurseries to carry more of the plants that they were looking for. And they frequently spent their time patrolling nurseries because their designs were all about the spaces, but they were also all about the plant selection that had to be perfect. One of the families that they got to know both in the 1930s and the 1950s was Cooley's Garden in Silverton, Oregon. Cooley's Garden started as an iris nursery founded by a couple when a member of their community in Silverton became one of the first well-known iris hybridizers. And this was the time period, the 1920s were really the heyday of perennial cultivation. Iris, peonies, and daylilies really came into the fore, but iris, I would say, were even first. I wanted to emphasize this because, again, I feel this is underemphasized in even most garden history books, the connection with the people who grow the plants and the people who use the plants in the designs. So we were able to contact the granddaughter of Roland Cooley, the founder of this nursery. I should have said Roland and his wife founded the nursery. And in 1931, Edith designed a display garden for them. And iris became such a major product coming out of Silverton. Cooley's Gardens was the largest supplier of iris cultivars in the world up until they closed, and they closed only a few years ago. And Silverton had an iris weekend. The nursery had an iris celebration every year. The American Iris Society met there. Then in 1951, Edith designed another display garden, which you see a beautiful photograph of on the right, that was created after World War II when things were beginning to speed up again. People were building more houses. Landscaping became very important for suburban areas, and the push was on for ornamental plants. So we also, their role, how's my time, Eleanor?
We're at about 5 till, so if we can go a little bit past 1 o'clock if people want to stick around for discussion. Okay.
So other areas where they were important, you know, from my perspective, having taught American and Western world landscape history for many years to students in Philadelphia, it's not enough to me that you're a garden designer. What was really important about these two ladies is the impact they had on their community and the larger community. They believed that they believed and they really wanted to educate the consumer about fine garden design and the finer plants to use to allow people to be really successful in creating home spaces, the work they did for parks, and they embraced technology wholeheartedly. So in the 1930s, the Federated Garden Club of Oregon decided that they were going to run radio hour programs through KOAC at Oregon State University. This was a venture funded by the USDA to reach out to rural communities. And it became a way of also reaching out to suburban communities, particularly women who were at home. So this radio program, this radio hour started the Garden Hour. The Federated Garden Club organized it. The first individuals they contacted for lectures were Elizabeth Lord and Edith Schryver, and they did several programs over the radio. during the 1930s and 40s. I think it lasted up until the 50s. And fortunately, there's a very good history of this as a graduate thesis. Now, the Garden Club didn't just say, well, listen to my program. They organized garden clubs that would send in their questions, and the following week, those questions would be answered. And then another group could send in their questions, and those questions could be answered. But also, the two ladies joined in the founding of the Oregon Society of Landscape Architects in 1940. At that time, neither state, Washington did not have a professional organization. The ASLA, the American Society of Landscape Architects, was founded in Boston in 1899, but it took a long time to spread to other state organizations. So they were pioneers and among the first committee to set up a professional organization. And during World War II, where most of the male professors and many of the students disappeared in the military, Edith Schryver went to Oregon State University and taught the landscape architecture courses for several years. She also taught adult ed in Salem at night during that time period. And for this reason, they're real founders of professionalism in the Northwest. Later, they even invited Washington State to participate with them, and they didn't. I'm not sure when they were founded. Among the most beautiful gardens that have survived that Lord and Schryver created in the 1950s was the Portland Garden Club, which you can visit today. The building is by one of the premier architects of the Northwestern style, John Storrs. The landscape is by Edith Schryver. The plantings have changed, but you can still have a sense of the space. Many of the trees are still there and the layout of this exquisite landscape. Civic projects, I don't even have to go through them. Salem Park Board, Street Tree Commission, the Capitol Mall, Bush's Pasture Park, Deepwood, Historic House Museum, schools and colleges, the Salem Art Association, and the first scenic highways law banning commercial advertising in Oregon. And this is started as a movement by the women's garden clubs of the US way before Lady Bird Johnson got in the act. And it's a very interesting history. So how are we doing here? Historic period landscapes, the boyhood home, the John McLaughlin House in 1909. He was head of the Hudson Bay Company for the Northwestern Territory. He was a Canadian and built a wonderful house along a river that had to be moved with development, and then the boyhood home of Herbert Hoover. Their historic landscapes are not restorations, they're recreations. And probably in the chat, we can hear about preserving this amazing legacy from members from our Oregon group. So I'll turn it over to the chat. Thank you.
Thank you, Libby, or Val, I'm sorry. That is, my doorbell is ringing. This always happens whenever I'm on a very important call. All of a sudden, everybody needs my attention. But that was lovely. And I have to say, I've watched a few of your other presentations, and I've read part of your book, and there's just so much more about this firm that I feel like we can't fit within a single hour presentation.
No.
So I mean, I know that I personally do have some questions. I have some questions on the side of the more technical aspect of running their business. And then I have some questions on the more social side of, you know, what it was like to start and manage a business as two women at this time. And I don't know if there's a preference from the group, you know, what are your interests? What would you like to hear about today? And if nobody wants to raise their hand, then I'll get started. But if there's anybody who has, a burning question for Val, I'm willing to stick around for at least another 5 minutes, if not longer. And I believe Karen, who is with us today, is works at the Lord and Schryver Conservancy in Salem. And I think we have a few other volunteers with the Conservancy here with us today. So these questions can go out to the group. That we don't even need to put Val in the hot seat. If we
We'll
want to
do our,
share
we'll do our best.
the burden, yeah. Well, why don't I get started? And why don't I get started with some of the more technical questions that I had?
Okay. Sure.
You know, I'm curious. You've mentioned some of the aspects of design that they learned at Lowthorpe, and you've mentioned some of the kind of characteristics of the gardens that they worked on, the axial relationships, the outdoor living component, the sequence of spaces, working with the architect to site the gardens with the buildings. But I'm wondering if you believe that there was a vernacular sort of style to the work that they did here. Were L&S's gardens Oregon gardens?
No, they brought a style to Oregon from Lowthorpe, and really a lot of the design influence, although I think Edith Schryver took it further, that was being practiced by Ellen Shipman and others when they were studying early 1900s, was colonial revival. And so it was designing, hi Bobby, there she is.
Well done.
Hello.
Dame Bobby Dope. So they were designing these more formal gardens with the beds outlined in low boxwood, because that was like a highlighting technique for the areas. Ellen Shipman was doing that, but they were also going beyond that as more individuals came into landscape architecture. You definitely have the influence for naturalistic design with Olmsted. And what I think surprised some is that Edith Schryver was able to understand that technique too, to do the naturalistic design for Brighton Bush Hot Springs. And also when she designed areas for public parks, some of them were built, some were not. There would be gathering places for people that might have a more formal design, but she understood naturalistic layout and naturalistic plantings. And they also understood that when you're doing public parks, you want to be using native plants. If you're planting into a woodland or a stream edge, you are not putting rose bushes in there. You know, you're not putting the ornamental cultivars in there. And I still see landscape architects today who don't understand the difference in which plants are suitable for which areas. But I would say the primary garden design style that was promoted was colonial revival. And then in the South, in Southern California, Southwest, you have Spanish colonial, right? With these formal patio areas with walled landscapes.
Interesting. I was looking at some of the pictures you put up, specifically, you know, this one here of Gavey Hollow on the right. I believe that. Oh, that's Deepwood. I'm sorry. Some of the more garden designs that they did in Salem, and thinking maybe this was colonial revival. But it's good to hear that.
It really is. And you know, many people today don't really understand that a lot of the garden heritage we have in New England is not colonial, it's colonial revival.
Right.
So
I know that I even make that mistake sometimes in my work.
Horrifying.
But we do have a question from Judy Wong in the chat. It's related to the firm's clientele in California, which is a very good question for today's lecture. Did they have a broader clientele that reached, you know, south of Oregon? And do you happen to know of any California projects that the firm
Not that
completed?
I know of. Karen, Bobby, do you know of any? I don't think we found any.
I believe they traveled to California quite
A
a bit.
lot, right.
But their 200 to 250 designs were in Oregon and Washington.
Washington, primarily, yes. Right. So, no.
And we have a very good record, it sounds like, of their their project lists. I mean, we know where they worked and who their clientele were. So if you didn't uncover any California projects in your research, it's likely that that they aren't known about if they exist.
Well, the research went on well before me, and I was just pulling pieces together, but a lot of the original research and oral interviews with people who knew them was done. And I worked from that, which is a huge advantage, because otherwise it would have been another 20 years probably to pull this all together. But also, I would imagine by the 1920s, Ellen Shipman's style had evolved. She was highly influenced by Charles Platt, who promoted the Italian villa and its gardens as the model. And there you have a lot of the axial planning. You have a lot of the succession of going from the building, the house, into a formal garden, and going into gradually less formal spaces as you move away from the building. Another landscape architect I studied, who was one of the first women to practice, was Marion Coffin. And she did have a formal education in design from MIT. And you see this same procedure, but some of her formal gardens take on that colonial revival appearance with the boxwood highlighting or lining, and some of them do not. And I do know, even when I was at Cornell in 1970 studying landscape architecture, there were no female faculty anywhere in this country in landscape architecture, zero. And there might have been one or two practitioners, and there was Cornelia Oberlander in Canada, and that was it. So there were no role models, and that's 1970, not 1910, 1920. That's how long it's taken.
I certainly feel that I would not have found my place in my own career without women mentors in my field who helped me along the way, who have helped me with the most basic elements of working, such as finding jobs and preparing for interviews. I mean, I think that is a striking part of the story for LNS as well. The fact that they went to an all-women program, the fact that Ellen Shipman was so involved in Edith's early career, and the fact that their earliest clients, if I understand correctly, were many well-to-do women in the Salem town who were willing to sort of take a chance on two women with a very limited portfolio when they started out. Do you have, and I, if I understand correctly, that's why you ended up connecting with the Conservancy and researching this topic, is because of your interest, your personal interest in women in the field.
Yeah. It's there's a small group of us who have worked on promoting women's history in landscape architecture and horticulture since the 1970s. And I entered into it because I was writing the Garden History of Winterthur Museum in Delaware. And the Henry Francis DuPont's best friend was Marion Coffin, the landscape architect. And that's why she ended up doing so many projects. And there is quite a difference between someone who has the formal education, which was associated with architecture at that time, and someone like Ellen Shipman, who had to make it up. She did not have the formal education. So Lowthorpe really did quite a good job with these women. It's very impressive. Plantsmanship has gone from landscape architecture, and I'm not sure when it left town, but it left. So combining the two talents, I mean, that was wonderful. There was another female landscape architect in Oregon, and her name was my friends in Salem.
Florence Gerke.
Right.
Yes. Okay.
Yay. Thank you. And she actually, Elizabeth Lord did write to her for her advice on what school to go to in the Boston area. And we're not sure what she said, but she was there also as a role model. and was one of the first people to get in touch with them when they came back in 1928, 29, even though they didn't work together.
I just had a little thought about going back to the first question in terms of their style. And there's a couple phrases that I think are kind of capture it. And one is informal formality, and the other is careless grace.
Careless grace.
I
Careless
like both
grace
of those, yeah.
and informal formality. The formality obviously being the boxwood framing the picture.
Right.
The informality being the, I don't want to say fluff, but the softness and the careless grace
The
hiding,
texture.
that is framed by the boxwood. So I think just kind of as for catchphrases, I think those kind of epitomize quite well the sense that one gets of, you say how people often say, or their neighbors tell them when they move in, you may have a Lord and Schryver garden. How do you know? Well, one obvious way is to check the records, et cetera.
Right.
And if there is no, direct evidence, then you look for characteristics, and
Right.
boxwood, of course, being one of them. But there are lots of features, the notion of rooms and traffic patterns and privacy, et cetera. But I think just to encapsulate it, careless grace and informal formality. And there were, of course, they had many people who tried to emulate their style, which of course is the ultimate form of flattery, I guess. So that shows their influence as well. And there are many gardens here in Salem that bear that influence without the proper, identification of records and plans, et cetera.
And when you say that, this is an interesting hybrid because the style that evolved for Lowthorpe and Ellen Shipman was really a hybrid between what Gertrude Jekyll was promoting and talking about and the colonial revival. Because you don't see colonial revivalism in Britain except if you're going to William and Mary College. I mean, if you're going to Hampton Court. In this country, William and Mary College, the original landscape, was the type of landscape that colonial revivalism is based on. So it's really a hybrid between the British love of plants and deciding to use them with color schemes and to carefully select your plants for texture and form and period of bloom, and the colonial revivalism, which took off in New England. But
they introduced many plants from the East. When they arrived, the nurseries were kind of a dearth, and there's a lot of correspondence between them, and they would go to rose shows and and try to not only roses, but evergreens, a variety of perennials that they would try to encourage local nurseries to expand their palette, if you will. So they were very influential in bringing,
absolutely,
and bringing, expanding the plant palette here, and as well as integrating plants from the East into the Northwest climate and soil types. So, and when you talked about hybrid, there was a hybrid in another way as well.
Right. Yeah. And a question came up earlier. Eleanor, I think, asked it about the number of Lord and Schryver gardens that have survived in Salem, and that perhaps, and I was saying one or two or more are usually on your garden tours. So would you like to talk about that?
We had, this year we had 4 Lord and Schryver home gardens on our tour. 2 were more complete, and 2 had vestiges of it, I would say, had remnants of it. And then down closer to Gady Hill, the Jarman House is very close to us here, and that's largely preserved. There's another home that recently came up for sale nearby. Is it the Walters Garden? And it's Smith. It's a Clarence Smith.
Walter Smith.
It was, and the design. So the architect was Clarence Smith, and it was also the Walter Smith garden. So that house is up for sale, and it has the boxwood left mainly. So it has the ability to be restored, but it's not currently restored.
No, it's not, no, not at all.
Yeah, and you can find pieces at Bush's Pasture Park, certainly Deepwood. We've spent a lot of time rehabilitating the 4 main garden rooms there.
Right.
There's little bits, you still can see the plane trees that are at the courthouse. And Englewood Park, some of the public parks still have the pathways and some of the trees. So there are vestiges of it here and there.
Well, and my colleague Janet put the Conservancy link in the chat a few minutes
good.
before 1 p.m. So if anybody
Oh,
wants to
thank you.
learn more about that, I know the book is also for sale, or links to the book are available on your website as well.
Mhm.
Thank you. Yes. I wanted to introduce Bobby also, because Bobby
Yes,
is one of the founders of the Lord and Schryver Conservancy and has worked diligently for over 20 years to preserve the memory of Lord and Schryver. So she was also a longtime president until me. So she was way longer than I have. So she's really the expert today from here.
Hi, Bobby. I believe I watched your a small clip with you presenting about Gaiety Hollow on TCLX website.
Oh, thank you.
Yes.
Good
Yeah,
memory to have.
Well, I was doing a little research just yesterday, so it's not that long of a memory, but yeah. So thank you for being here and helping us talk about Lord and Schryver. Something that I think this should probably be the last question, but one thing I did want to offer to both the Conservancy and to Val is that when you look at the pictures here on the screen and the attendance at today's talk and based on some of our discussions, I mean, it's very clear to me that women are yearning for these types of role models and examples in our field. That this is something that we look for, we seek out, and we appreciate, and something that we're working, a legacy that we're working to preserve and continue. I had mentioned to Val before we began that it seemed to me that the focus was very much on their gender and not so much on their personal relationship. And my question was, what do we know about the personal relationship between these two women? And was it intentional that we don't focus on their personal relationship? So Val, I was wondering if maybe you could share with the group some of the answer that you provided to me earlier, because I think this is a common question.
Remember, Bobby, one of my first questions was whether I could talk about them as a lesbian couple. And we talked about the fact, is this what you're getting at, Eleanor?
Yeah, it seems like there's a very
Yeah.
distinct community here that's interested in this firm. And I live in San Francisco, and there's a very active LGBTQ community here that's working to landmark and preserve landscapes associated with that community. And I'm wondering why that hasn't been part of this discussion.
So the question did come up because I was aware of the growing interest and the growing interest in literature for LGBT, et cetera, community for works like this. And Bobby informed me that there really wasn't any documentation left that could prove that. And certainly with what I found, there wasn't anything. And I never heard stories of the two ladies or read anything in interviews where they expressed very close physical affection for each other around the public. They had a house built with 2 separate bedrooms. So, we can't speculate. Well, maybe the word is we can speculate, but we can't state that this relationship was truly a lesbian relationship.
If there was any romantic connection there, right?
Yeah, I think certainly there was a very strong emotional connection, as there have been with many women in teams. They were a real team in the past, but it's not like Virginia Woolf. Right?
Yeah.
So,
I think people just read into that what they want to.
yeah, right. And they can kind of figure it out on their own. But as a historian, I can't say it. And I wouldn't want to, because I wouldn't want to mislead people. And I certainly didn't know them. And in the work that I've done with landscape history, even at Winterthur Museum, there was significant proof of various gay members of the DuPont family. Well, I couldn't talk about it in the garden history, that's for sure. It would have made a more lively story, but
Interesting.
I didn't know these people. Yeah.
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 I guess, the time it was just that was a private, that was not part of the business plan. And I certainly understand that. But when I see the kind of, yearning that among women for role models, I wonder, that must exist in other communities. This search for, ourselves in influential and early practitioners of our fields.
I think that in the terms of the story of their contribution to landscape architecture, it really is irrelevant. And I think that's what we need to focus on. That's our intention. That's our mission. And so the people are always interested in people's personal lives, but let's leave it to their thoughts and what they want to believe. And it doesn't really, it really doesn't change what they contributed to landscape architecture at all.
No.
So I guess we can at least state that it didn't negatively impact their business, their personal relationship.
We have no, it's interesting. There are no photos, no documentation. And so I don't know that it wouldn't have affected their business. We just met a granddaughter of Alice Brown, who was one of the owners at Deepwood. And when she came to visit and we said, oh, we're from the Lord and Schryver Conservancy. Oh, we miss those girls. They were so much fun. That was the first thing. So I think that's really how they remember. They were remembered as by they were so both very active in the community, helping with a lot of civic affairs. And so, I don't see any old newspaper articles. There's,
there's nothing
about that. Yeah. But also it was the practice of people when they died to have their personal belongings destroyed. So what's been preserved are the professional papers that are housed at the University of Oregon. So so I guess we just, as Val was saying, because we don't have strong evidence one way or the other, we really can't say anything.
Yeah, that's a good point, because as Karen mentioned, all the personal letters, et cetera, were destroyed. And so those who want to say, there's proof, of whatever they want to believe. But if you put that in context, you recognize that was the behavior of the time. So it was not an unusual event. It was de rigueur. It's what people did in those days. So for whatever reason.
We're really entering a very new era in time in the way of exposing lost histories and buried histories. And for museums now, it's tough. And I've been talking to Ross Sutherland at the Bush House Museum, and we've been sharing articles, one of which I just sent to Bobby, and I have a 19-year-old mentee, is that the word, in the museum field, and what he thinks in terms of exposing these histories is rather different from what I think. So we talk about this quite a bit, and it's really going to be a challenge. It is going to be a challenge in who does it, where do you do it, how is it done in a helpful way and not a hurtful or harmful way? Are these stories revealed in the art museum or the history museum? Are they revealed in garden history? Yes, they certainly are. But not, to do it without documentation, nah.
Well, I suppose one thing we can say is that it's a very kind of a good example of simply a chosen family, an alternative family system that I also think is part of the conversation.
Absolutely.
So I really, this has really piqued my interest, and I'm looking forward to finishing the book.
Good.
And thank you so much for coming out and meeting with us today. It's almost 1:30, so we've gone way over, but
oh dear.
So I should probably wrap it up, but I do think that, like I said, there's just so much to discuss. I'm not that surprised.
All right, bye, folks. From the
Thank you
east
so
to
much.
the west. See you
Thank
again.
you to the Conservancy folks for joining us today. It was nice to meet everybody, and it was nice to meet you, Val.
Thank you.
Thank
And
you.
if anybody's
Thank
still
you.
listening and is curious, I know that Val has another lecture coming up about Maine gardens on October 18th. It's with the Royal Caledonian Society of Scotland. Is that correct?
Wow.
It's the Royal Caledonian Horticultural
Horticultural
Society
Society.
of
Mouthful.
Scotland.
And where can people find out details for that if they're interested?
They can go to the website. It's rchs.org under events.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure to meet everybody. It was a pleasure to learn more about LNS, and I hope to make it up to Salem sometime very soon.
We'd love to have you. Thank you.
Great.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.